Reflexive impotence is a term coined by the late, great Mark Fisher. Reflexive impotence is the state of knowing the flawed nature of late-stage capitalism but believing there are no means of effecting change. Thus, the inaction to do anything due to the idea there is no viable alternative creates a self-fulfilling prophecy, and the cycle continues. Whilst originally written as a commentary on neoliberal England in the early 2000s, due to the replicable nature inherent in end-stage capitalism, the idea can be broadly applied to the monocultural landscape of the contemporary Western world of today. I want to use this idea of reflexive impotence to touch upon some phenomena in the modern activist zeitgeist. The first being the concept of what activism is. Activism now is solely symbolic. It is largely show, don't do. The black squares on Instagram, the hashtags on another social media site, the chants in the street, the prearranged protest has to be allowed by the council so they can deploy the police and control the masses. All of it is a perverse form of virtue signaling. One can attend one of these establishment organized events, hold the placards up in the street and go home, content that, hey, at least they did something. The reflexive impotence subsides momentarily before they realize that nothing changed the next day, and it sets in once more, realizing the system is still the same, nothing of note changed, no one listened, and the cogs of the machine were on and on and on. The modern activist zeitgeist is probably best defined as the activist industrial complex, a term coined by another contemporary juggernaut, Peter Joseph. The idea underpinning this notion is the idea that if we truly live in a genuine democracy, activism wouldn't be necessary. Democracy, as in the rule of the people, would satiate the general will of the masses equally. There wouldn't be a need to protest, scream, and pursue change. But of course, we don't live in a democracy. We barely live in one. The option to vote in an election decided more by the mass media tycoons than the average man does not equate to democracy. You don't get to choose how money is spent, you don't get to choose where your taxes go, you don't get to decide who your boss is at work. You don't get to decide if the central bank should print more money for more bombs and more death. You decide very little. So activism is created to alleviate some societal tensions, an illusion that the people in power are actually listening when in fact they're not. Remember the 1 million march against the war in London? Remember Occupy? Remember Extinction Rebellion? They do not listen. They cordon some roads off so that people can chant down the street, and then everyone returns home. The street sweepers come and everything returns to normal as it was before. This isn't just a feeling either. According to Martin Gillens and Benjamin Page, the preferences of the average American appear to have only a minuscule, near zero statistically non-significant impact upon public policy. No, activism and the state of it has been commodified to the point of acting, according to Joseph, as both a marketable phenomenon and a societal pressure valve. The market of anti-establishmentarianism is unquestionably very profitable. Anonymous masks, Banksy, punk music, organic food, renewable energy, manifestos, and even thrift stores have all acted as symbolic consumables, which people may be genuinely inclined to see societal change are co-opted into purchasing and thus supporting the status quo. These symbolic consumables alleviate the need for concrete action and real change. Secondly, the phenomenon of activism acts as an illusion. The illusion of causality, that if people protest, then change is enacted. This isn't necessarily true. Sure, one could point to the civil rights movement or gay rights, etc., but these weren't enacted from activism alone. No, beyond the virtue signaling and the chants was real bloodshed and real action on behalf of those that sought change. Change is not gifted by the elites, it is taken from them by the masses. Mass activism, the idea of chanting in the street, protests cordoned off by police, and hashtags on social media do nothing but feed into the feedback loop of reflective impotence and the perpetuation of a system that has the interests of only the elite. It acts as a pressure valve of tension, when in fact we should let that tension simmer, as only in times of tension against the establishment does real change occur. Which brings me on to my next point, the case for armed struggle. Is this a viable resolution to overcome reflexive impotence? Black Panthers, the Weather Underground, the Red Army faction, FARC, Castro, Guevara, Trotsky, Lenin, Mao, and Ho Chi Minh. Revolutionary vanguards of the 20th century, all of which pursued a non-peaceful pursuit to reclaim power and return it to the masses. But did it work? Their effectiveness, of course, varies. Cuba, Vietnam, and China are all still loosely and broadly communist, with a spectrum of difference between them, of course, whereas groups like the Red Army faction and Weather Underground failed almost immediately. The Black Panthers, well, a historical fact that they indeed affected the civil rights movement and were definitely agents of change, but to what extent is largely interpretive. And of course, FARC are still very much fighting their own fight. The effectiveness of violent uprising is like this throughout time. It takes a disaster, a unifying voice, galvanized masses, and a spark of revolutionary opportunity that comes almost never to see through a successful uprising. However, the elites of the world will never allow it. They will print money arbitrarily to keep the Western order afloat and thus mitigate any disaster by keeping it sanitized, infantilized, and safe. The next trick to keeping it from going that way, at least according to the elites, is to extinguish that spark at a moment's notice, to isolate, imprison, and silence by any means necessary that unifying voice, and for their final trick, keep the masses atomized, divided, and distrustful of one another. Of course, violent uprising is very much a tempting fantasy, but in the current divisive societies of the Western Hemisphere, it is unlikely that a revolutionary group will be marred as anything other than a terrorist organization, hell-bent on destroying the fabric of society. People will consume the narrative and will do the bidding of the powerful to exterminate such dissidents, and thus the system will likely continue as it was before. So, what about non-violent uprising, or as Thoreau referred to it, civil disobedience? Is that a viable solution to overcome reflexive impotence? In principle and in a perfect world, then yes, it would be. It would seek to resolve societal ills not through bombings and bloodshed, but through dialogue and unharmful law breaking. The problem of civil disobedience in the modern age is twofold. The Huxley-esque saturation of information prevents any reasonable dialogue or any proclamations of importance to simply be lost into the ether and the vapid, titillating gossip that prevails and disseminates itself far quicker than any call to civil action. Secondly, is that as a society, we have created what can only be described as a digital panopticon. In places like China, this is taken to the extreme, with social credit scoring, but in the West we are no better ourselves. When we have minor incursions against law, such as Extinction Rebellion, the masses come out in arms across social media to scorn, share, and shame. The media machine has done such a good job of manufacturing consent for the masses that even the slightest incursion on the law, non-violent, and by all accounts peaceful, are met with calls for prison time by the masses the groups are earnestly trying to defend. So, in turn, what happens is a need for the protest movements to justify themselves in order to placate the masses, so that a modicum of their message can be heard. But it isn't. The airwaves and all utilities of communication are controlled by corporate entities that have a vested interest in you not knowing about the call for societal change and instead to know what Kardashian is sucking which. So, what do we do? Stuck in a collective inertia whereby we know the problem and we know somewhat how to solve it, and we must rely on miracles to remedy it. We need a Goldilocks of societal circumstance. Unification on a societal level against one common goal, while simultaneously maintaining a resistance from the messaging from corporate elites via social and mass media to not challenge the status quo. Because fear, fear, fear will keep us in tow. Thus, we are stuck in a cyclical downfall, edging closer to the system that we can't stand and yet we can't live without, riding the death spiral to the very end. The fall of our empires will be a whimper in the grand narrative of history, but the fall of our species will be a deafening silence that will reverberate across the galaxy. And we are stuck in the face of this awareness, simply because we are frozen in our reflexive impotence. As Fisher said, It is easier to imagine the end of the world than an end to capitalism. But not only that, according to Fisher, we are stuck culturally in a state that transposes cultural moments from the past, remixes them into our current cultural milieu, and disguises the old as something new. This failure to innovate both systematically and culturally is what Fisher calls the slow cancellation of the future. Fisher states, while 20th century experimental culture was seized by a recombinational delirium, which made it feel as if newness was infinitely available, the 21st century is oppressed by a crushing sense of finitude and exhaustion. It doesn't feel like the future, or alternatively, it doesn't feel as if the 21st century has started yet. The slow cancellation of the future has been accompanied by a deflation of expectation. The slow cancellation of the future echoes the ongoing gentrification of culture, which I discussed in a recent blog post, but is essentially the takeover of the art world by the middle classes and people of privilege. This has eradicated the struggle within creativity, a key element in innovating art and culture. Fisher states, the other explanation for the link between late capitalism and retrospection centers on production. Despite all its rhetoric of novelty and innovation, neoliberal capitalism has gradually but systematically deprived artists of the resources necessary to produce the new. In all, this feeling of repetition and the void of innovation in the cultural zeitgeist spurs furthermore an incessant relegation in oneself. And to fill the void and discontentment, one feels the need to consume, and consume. Fisher brilliantly characterizes this as a state of depressive hedonia, a phenomenon describing the inability to do anything other than pursue pleasure, a feeling deep within that there is something missing, but no appreciation that this mysterious missing enjoyment can only be accessed beyond the pleasure principle. In short, this depressive hedonia that is evoked from a spiritual void that capitalism enables again puts us into a cynical cycle that feeds the mechanisms of consumerism that keep capitalism afloat. We must reconcile the feeling of doom with the very real possibility that we must escape the pursuit of pleasure and instead pursue an alternative future, a real alternative. The world is what we collectively decide to make it. We collectively face a crossroads, one of remaining frustrated, impotent, and stuck in a cycle of depressive hedonia, or something more, something bigger than all of us. After all, to end this video with a quote by the late David Graeber, the ultimate hidden truth of the world is that it is something that we make and could just as easily make differently. Thank you for watching. Please check out the show notes on my website. And for more writings, follow my Substack. Any and all support is welcome, be it a like and a subscribe, or if you want to support me on these channels, please do. Until next time, peace.